January 14th, 1942. The Atlantic is a silver-gray wasteland. Ice cracks along the hulls of freighters, and the wind carries the bitter taste of salt and metal. Waves surge like liquid steel, crashing against the bow of an American destroyer as it cuts through the winter sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon, faint silhouettes of enemy U-boats slice through the darkness, unseen, their periscopes glinting in the cold dawn. On the deck, sailors hunch against the wind, eyes scanning the fog for the slightest shadow. Every creak of timber, every distant splash feels like a warning. Breath forms clouds that vanish instantly into the cold. Below deck, radar operators monitor a screen that glows with pale green sweeps, lines moving, dots emerging. Some men don't yet know the advantage it brings. Others trust it implicitly, relying on this new technology to pierce the shroud of uncertainty. Across the ocean, Axis commanders smile at what they believe is an empty expanse. They see no threat, only the vast, treacherous water and a handful of distant convoys. They think the Americans are lost, drifting, helpless. But the sea has secrets. And on this day, the hum of electronics and the keen eyes of watchful sailors will reveal the unseen. What the Axis cannot detect, radar will expose. What they dismiss as invisible, reality will prove otherwise. A battle for life and survival is about to unfold, and the ocean itself will become both shield and battlefield. By early 1942, the world was in turmoil. Europe had fallen under the shadow of Axis power, and across the Atlantic, the United States had only recently entered the war. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had thrust America in a conflict, but the nation's naval forces were still consolidating, learning to operate across vast oceans under the constant threat of an unseen enemy. Ships that had once patrolled coastal waters were now part of massive convoys, tasked with carrying men, weapons, and vital supplies to embattled allies in Britain and beyond. Each voyage carried with it the weight of strategic necessity and the ever-present risk of annihilation. For the Axis, the Atlantic was a hunting ground. German U-boats prowled in wolf packs, coordinated strikes designed to overwhelm the limited escort vessels that protected merchant convoys. The Kriegsmarine had perfected this deadly rhythm. Periscopes glinting just above the waves, torpedoes launched silently in the night, and radio transmissions guiding submerged hunters to their prey. Commanders back in Berlin calculated losses with clinical precision, convinced that the Americans, new to the theater, lacked both experience and the technology to challenge them effectively. In their eyes, the Atlantic was a vast, forgiving ocean, and Allied ships were scattered, vulnerable, and easy to find. But technology was shifting the balance. Radar, a secretive and evolving tool, was beginning to change naval warfare. Initially experimental and limited in range, radar offered the unprecedented ability to detect ships and aircraft beyond visual sight, through fog, darkness, and storm. American destroyers and escort carriers were being outfitted with this new technology at a hurried pace, sometimes fitted with crude screens and dials, yet capable of providing early warning against an enemy that had assumed invisibility. Sailors who had never seen such instruments now studied glowing green sweeps, translating blips into actionable intelligence, and officers began to plan maneuvers based on signals that the enemy could not comprehend. Meanwhile, convoys themselves had become a lifeline. Each transport vessel bristled with supplies, each destroyer a guardian against the unseen threat beneath the waves. Coordination between ships was vital. Signaling had to be discreet, movements precise. One misstep could mean destruction in the cold embrace of the Atlantic, and the men aboard these ships were acutely aware of the stakes. Nights were long and silent except for the thrum of engines and the occasional crack of distant gunfire. Cold seeped into bones. Morale fluctuated with every sighting of a distant shadow on the radar, and the ocean itself seemed to test resolve. Intelligence played a crucial role as well. The Americans had begun decoding Axis communications, but the U-boat war was fluid and patterns shifted faster than analysts could track. For the Axis, confidence remained high. For the Americans, vigilance was everything. Each convoy that set out carried not only material, but the burden of proving that radar, skill, and coordination could counter a threat that seemed omnipresent and invisible. By the middle of January 1942, the Atlantic had become a theater of tension and uncertainty. The Axis believed that American convoys were scattered, unprepared, and vulnerable, adrift in a sea that offered no refuge. But the U.S. Navy, rapidly learning and adapting, had begun to leverage technology and human ingenuity in ways that the enemy could not yet anticipate. Small victories in reconnaissance, early detection, and evasive maneuvering were quietly reshaping the rules of engagement. Ships that might once have been easy prey now carried eyes in the dark, instruments that could peer through the fog, and men willing to push beyond fear to protect lives and cargo alike. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test the limits of endurance, strategy, and technology. The Axis underestimated the Americans' ability to see beyond the horizon, and in doing so, sowed the seeds of their own miscalculation. Radar would become the instrument of revelation, the unseen force that would expose hidden threats, guide sailors through deadly waters, and ultimately prove that what the Axis assumed lost at sea was, in fact, far from helpless. Convoys had become the backbone of Allied strategy. Merchant vessels, often slow and lightly armed, traveled in tight formations under the watchful protection of destroyers, corvettes, and, later, escort carriers. Each convoy was a floating puzzle. Supply ships carrying food, ammunition, tanks, and aircraft had to stay together, maintaining speed and position while navigating thousands of miles across unpredictable waters. Coordination was exacting. Signals flashed in coded lights, flags waved against gray skies, and radio silence was enforced to avoid giving away positions. The ocean itself was both ally and adversary. Currents and fog could conceal an approaching threat, or, just as easily, leave ships exposed. Meanwhile, the German U-boat strategy had evolved into the infamous wolf pack tactic. Rather than attacking individually, submarines patrolled vast stretches of ocean, sharing intelligence to mass forces against convoys. One lone vessel could shadow a convoy for hours or even days, transmitting location updates back to command. Then, under cover of night, multiple submarines would strike in concert. Torpedoes would cut through the cold water with lethal precision, leaving ships crippled or sunk before escorts could respond. Success relied on stealth, timing, and the assumption that the Allies could not detect them before it was too late. For the Axis, this method had worked with devastating effect in 1940 and 1941, sinking thousands of tons of shipping and instilling fear in every merchant sailor. Yet the Allies were not passive. Radar had begun to level the playing field, allowing ships to detect surface contacts and aircraft beyond visual range. Operators learned to interpret the subtle blips, distinguishing between small craft, periscopes, and the shadows of larger ships. Convoy escorts could now anticipate attacks, repositioning vessels to protect the most vulnerable cargo. Even in poor visibility, radar gave Americans the ability to engage the enemy on their own terms, a quiet revolution in naval warfare. Intelligence further strengthened their position. Codebreakers at Bletchley Park in England and listening stations in the United States began deciphering Enigma transmissions, providing insight into U-boat positions, patrol patterns, and intended targets. The Axis assumed the Americans were blind at sea, but convoys now moved under a veil of information. Radar readings in real time, intercepted signals guiding decisions, and meticulous planning that made previously vulnerable ships far more resilient. Each voyage became a combination of human skill and technological foresight, where the slightest error could spell disaster. Despite these advantages, the Atlantic remained a perilous expanse. Ice-slicked decks, freezing winds, and relentless storms tested both men and machines. Fatigue was constant. Sailors spent long hours at the helm, scanning the gray horizon or monitoring the radar screen, every sense heightened. Even with early detection, A torpedo could strike before a countermeasure was in place. Convoys had to move swiftly, maintain cohesion, and trust in technology that was still evolving. In many ways, the ocean itself was a character in this conflict. Indifferent, unforgiving, yet capable of hiding dangers that the human eye alone could never see. Axis commanders, meanwhile, continued to miscalculate. Reports from U-boats suggested that convoys were scattered and slow, that American destroyers lacked the experience or coordination to protect their charges. This overconfidence led to repeated underestimation of radar-equipped ships. The Germans believed the vast Atlantic was an open hunting ground and that their adversaries were lost at sea, drifting helplessly into danger. In reality, each convoy had become a moving fortress, guided by both human intuition and the invisible eye of radar. By mid-January 1942, the tension between perception and reality was reaching a critical point. The Axis saw a vulnerable enemy. The Americans, however, had begun to master the unseen. Ships moved with purpose, blips on a radar screen translated into evasive maneuvers, and officers coordinated actions that kept convoys largely intact despite the lurking threat of the wolf pack. What the enemy assumed invisible was now trackable. What the Axis believed lost at sea was, in fact, carefully protected, guided by technology that would soon prove decisive in shaping the Atlantic campaign. The stage was now set for the Americans to confront the illusion of invisibility. Radar would not merely warn them. It would change the rules of engagement, forcing the Axis to confront a reality they had long dismissed. On the deck of a destroyer cutting through the Atlantic waves, sailors were the first to feel the tension of this new age of naval warfare. They were men who had learned to trust their eyes and instincts, yet now they had to depend on glowing screens and electronic signals. Radar operators sat in dimly lit compartments, eyes fixed on the faint green sweeps that moved across the glass. Each blip represented a possibility, a harmless fishing vessel, a shadow of cloud, or a predator waiting beneath the waves. Mistakes could cost lives. The responsibility was immense, and yet there was a growing sense of empowerment. Unlike earlier convoys, where attacks often came without warning, these men could anticipate, prepare, and sometimes even avoid danger altogether. The human element was as critical as the technology itself. Keen observation, disciplined reporting, and split-second decisions could turn potential catastrophe into survival. Below deck, officers studied radar readouts alongside traditional charts. They debated maneuvers, measured distances, and calculated probabilities. In the chill of the engine room, amid the constant hum of machinery, sailors and officers alike felt the psychological weight of the Atlantic. Waves crashed against the hull with relentless force, spray stinging frozen faces, yet focus never wavered. Each man knew that the invisible eye of radar was their lifeline, and that human skill would determine how effectively they used it. Tactical angle. Tactics had evolved dramatically with the introduction of radar. Convoy escorts no longer reacted blindly to U-boat attacks. They could anticipate them. Destroyers patrolled the flanks, using radar sweeps to scan ahead and around the formation, while smaller corvettes protected the rear. Early detection allowed ships to reposition before torpedoes struck, creating a defensive bubble that transformed vulnerability into a controlled environment. Coordination became precise. Convoy leaders communicated with coded signals, plotting movements that considered wind, wave, and enemy position. Every maneuver was informed not by fear, but by calculated intelligence. Wolfpack tactics, once overwhelmingly effective, now faced a formidable challenge. U-boats could no longer approach undetected, and simultaneous strikes became riskier. Convoys could scatter and regroup based on radar information, forcing Axis commanders to make difficult choices. Should they engage and risk exposure, or retreat and lose the opportunity? The tactical landscape had shifted. The Americans were no longer passive prey, drifting helplessly at sea. They had regained agency in a theater where invisibility had once been the enemy's greatest weapon. Technological angle. Radar was the invisible hand guiding these operations. Early systems, while primitive by modern standards, represented a revolution in naval warfare. American radars could detect ships at several miles distance, even in darkness or fog. Operators learned to distinguish shapes and sizes, identifying periscopes or distant destroyers. The technology extended the senses beyond human limitations. Each sweep of the radar antenna provided information that, once interpreted correctly, became a tactical advantage. The learning curve was steep. Electronic interference, weather conditions, and the constant motion of the ship complicated readings. Yet as crews became proficient, radar transformed the Atlantic. It allowed convoys to anticipate attacks, maneuver to safety, and engage only when advantageous. Axis forces, unaware of the full scope of this technology, continued to assume American vulnerability. They had not yet realized that what appeared empty to the naked eye was, in fact, carefully monitored, mapped, and defended. The interplay of human skill, tactical ingenuity, and technology created a new kind of warfare. Sailors adapted to instruments that extended their perception, officers made decisions informed by real-time data, and convoys moved with a precision that contradicted Axis expectations. What had once been a simple ocean crossing had become a dynamic, strategic environment. Survival depended not solely on courage or firepower, but on the effective integration of human and technological capability. Radar was not just a tool. It was a paradigm shift. It changed what could be known, what could be anticipated, and ultimately, what could be controlled. The human mind, previously constrained by the limits of sight and experience, now collaborated with an unseen electronic partner. The Atlantic, long a domain of uncertainty and fear, began to reveal its secrets. And in doing so, it exposed the flawed assumptions of an enemy that believed the Americans were lost at sea. Leadership angle. Leadership at sea had always been a matter of instinct and experience, but in 1942, it also required a mastery of emerging technology. American officers found themselves balancing age-old maritime principles with data from radar screens, charts, and code-breaking reports. Decisions had to be immediate, precise, and often made under conditions of uncertainty. Captain James E. Jimmy Doyle, commanding one of the early radar-equipped destroyers, described the weight of responsibility. Every blip represented a potential threat. Every maneuver could save or doom hundreds of lives. Orders were given crisply, drills executed without hesitation, and trust in both men and instruments became paramount. Leadership was no longer just about courage at the helm. It was about interpreting information faster than the enemy could act. In real time, officers coordinated multi-ship movements with astonishing precision. They issued commands for evasive zigzags, repositioning escorts to shield vulnerable merchant vessels. Radar allowed them to spot U-boat periscopes before the enemy even knew they were detected. Officers developed tactics that combined intuition with science, anticipating where submarines would strike, how they might approach, and the exact moment to counterattack. Every decision shaped the survival of convoys and, by extension, the larger war effort. Leadership was measured not just in bravery, but in vision, adaptability, and the ability to integrate human and technological assets seamlessly. Enemy perspective. From the German side, confidence was high. U-boat commanders believed the Atlantic was a vast hunting ground and that the Americans were inexperienced, reactive, and poorly coordinated. Reports from submarines indicated scattered targets, limited escort capabilities, and frequent miscalculations by Allied officers. This assumption of vulnerability created a dangerous overconfidence. The wolf packs moved with precision, yet blind to the revolution quietly taking place aboard American vessels. Axis intelligence failed to account for radar's growing impact. Where commanders once relied on visual sightings and reported positions, they now faced a reality in which American ships could anticipate attacks before they began. Periscopes were detected, distances calculated, and maneuvering countered. What the Germans assumed to be chaos at sea was, in fact, organized, informed, and increasingly lethal to any U-boat that misjudged its prey. This gap between expectation and reality would soon translate into operational failure, exposing the human cost of technological ignorance. Moral/strategic angle. The moral implications of radar's introduction were subtle but profound. Convoys, once vulnerable, were now protected in ways previously impossible. Lives that might have been lost to the stealthy approach of torpedoes were saved. Sailors and officers carried not only the burden of transporting critical supplies, but also the knowledge that every decision could preserve human life. Confidence grew among crews, and with it morale. Men who had once felt helpless in the vast Atlantic learned to trust their instruments, their training, and each other. Strategically, radar reshaped naval engagement. It turned passive convoys into active participants in the battle, challenging the once dominant Axis U-boat operations. American forces could now detect, evade, or even engage the enemy under more favorable conditions. Losses were reduced, missions completed more effectively, and the illusion of American vulnerability was shattered. Convoys became moving fortresses, their effectiveness amplified by the union of human skill and technological foresight. Technological moral interplay. Perhaps most striking was the interplay between technology and morality. Radar was not merely a tool, it was a guardian. Each detected threat represented a life potentially saved. It forced officers to make faster, more informed ethical decisions, when to risk an engagement, when to evade, and when to protect cargo at all costs. Technology amplified the moral weight of command. Men were no longer defenseless. They were armed with knowledge, able to act decisively in the service of survival and mission success. The ocean, long indifferent, now contained elements of control, foresight, and protection, redefining what it meant to fight at sea. Together, these angles, human resilience, tactical innovation, technological mastery, inspired leadership, enemy misjudgment, and moral responsibility, converged to create a critical dynamic. The Axis assumed the Americans were adrift and powerless, but in reality, every radar sweep, every calculated maneuver, every officer's decision, and every sailor's alertness was weaving a story of preparedness, insight, and survival. The stage was now fully set. All elements, men, machines, strategy, and morale, were poised for the decisive confrontation that would prove the Atlantic was no longer an empty expanse for the Axis to dominate. Radar would illuminate the unseen, and in doing so, alter the course of naval warfare. February 7, 1942. The Atlantic lay gray and turbulent, waves slamming against the hulls of convoy PQ-17 as it pressed northward toward the icy ports of the Soviet Union. The men aboard the American destroyers knew the stakes. Vital supplies of tanks, ammunition, and fuel were on the line, and somewhere beneath the churning surface, German U-boats prowled, waiting to strike. In the pre-dawn gloom, the radar screens hummed softly, a green pulse cutting through darkness and fog, translating the invisible into a language they could act upon. At 0432 hours, a blip appeared, small at first, then growing larger with each sweep. The operator's hand hovered over the plotting table. Contact bearing 075, range 12,000 yards, he reported. The officer on watch glanced at the charts, recalculating the convoy's course. A U-boat was closing in, silently, its periscope barely piercing the waves. In the past, detection would have relied on sight alone, a game of chance under fog and darkness. Now, technology provided certainty, and with certainty came choice. The destroyers shifted into action. The tactical formations, rehearsed countless times, became alive. Escorts moved outward to create a protective screen, engines throttled for speed and agility. Each radar sweep revealed not just one submarine, but a shadow trailing the convoy, and another lurking further ahead. Wolf packs, once confident in their invisibility, were now vulnerable. The Americans were no longer the prey. They were hunters in their own right. Captain Doyle issued precise orders, his voice calm but firm over the radio. Prepare for evasive maneuvers. Keep the convoy tight. Plot all contacts. Do not engage unless necessary. Every man followed protocol, executing drills that would have been inconceivable a year earlier. Below deck, radar operators tracked the U-boats as if reading a map of unseen currents, predicting where they might strike, calculating distance, speed, and angle. Moments stretched as decisions hung between life and death. The first attack came just as dawn broke. A torpedo sliced through the waves, narrowly missing a merchant vessel. The escorting destroyer had already anticipated the trajectory, swinging its bow to deflect and illuminate the threat. Depth charges exploded nearby, sending shivering shockwaves through the water. Underwater, the U-boat reeled, disoriented by countermeasures it had not anticipated. Radar had revealed its presence before the strike, and the American crew responded with the precision of experience honed by technology. For the U-boat commander, the scenario was bewildering. Every approach was detected, every maneuver anticipated. Contact appeared on screens like ghosts that could not be ignored. The Wolfpack's advantage, surprise, had evaporated. Communications attempted back to headquarters were delayed or misread, further amplifying the uncertainty. German calculations, once so reliable in the Atlantic, failed to predict the new reality. One by one, the U-boats found themselves unable to penetrate the defensive perimeter, forced to retreat into deeper waters, leaving the convoy intact. The human element remained crucial. Sailors braved icy decks, rain and spray soaking them to the bone, hands gripping railings and weapons alike. Officers coordinated movements, shouted orders, and relied on the judgment of their men. Radar was powerful, but it required interpretation, decisive action, and trust in the people behind the instruments. Here, technology and human skill merged into a seamless force, one that the Axis could neither see nor anticipate. By 0900 hours, the engagement had reached a turning point. The convoy had survived multiple shadowing attempts, and the U-boats, frustrated and exposed, were withdrawing. Radar had provided early warning, guided evasive maneuvers, and allowed selective counterattacks without risking merchant ships. The Atlantic, which the Axis had assumed would swallow convoys with impunity, had become a battlefield illuminated by unseen eyes. The Americans had demonstrated that what the enemy believed lost at sea was, in fact, far from helpless. The significance of this encounter extended beyond immediate survival. For the men aboard PQ-17, it was a lesson in the evolving nature of naval warfare. Confidence in technology, coupled with disciplined execution of strategy, could neutralize even the most formidable hunter. And for the Axis, the reality was inescapable. Radar had shattered the illusion of invisibility, exposing vulnerabilities that had been long ignored. The ocean, once an indifferent expanse, now bore witness to a tactical revolution. Every pulse of the radar, every maneuver executed with precision, and every decision made in the frigid dawn was a testament to adaptation, foresight, and courage. The Axis had believed the Americans were lost, drifting aimlessly in a hostile sea. But in the cold, gray morning, with waves slamming against steel and blips on a screen revealing the hidden, the illusion had been decisively proven false. The survivors of this encounter would carry the knowledge that the Atlantic could be navigated, that danger could be detected and countered, and that technology, when coupled with human resolve, could tip the balance in a theater once dominated by uncertainty and fear. By late morning, the tension had reached a near breaking point. The convoy's journey through the North Atlantic was far from over, but the initial engagement had already exposed the Axis miscalculation. Radar operators reported intermittent contacts, U-boats attempting to shadow the convoy, yet each approach was anticipated, countered, and tracked. The once feared Wolfpack now operated in a state of cautious frustration. Every blip on the green screen represented an enemy that could be engaged or avoided, giving American commanders a degree of control previously unimaginable at sea. Captain Doyle coordinated with other destroyers, maintaining a rotating screen around the convoy. Depth charges were prepped, patterns calculated to intercept submerged contacts before torpedoes could be launched. Sailors moved with grim efficiency, their faces lined with ice and fatigue, yet their hands steady and eyes alert. Orders were repeated, verified, and executed, ensuring that no angle of attack went unmonitored. Every radar sweep, every plotted contact was an exercise in survival, a choreography of technology and human precision. At 1,130 hours, a U-boat attempted a bold maneuver, closing from the port side under the cover of a low fog bank. The operator's voice broke the tense silence. Bearing 0, range 6,500 yards. Submerged. Immediately, destroyers adjusted their positions, closing the gap while escorting the vulnerable cargo vessels toward the safer center of the convoy. Depth charges were launched with exact timing. The water exploded in violent showers, shock waves vibrating through the hulls, sending small debris and foam skyward. Silence returned, broken only by the hum of engines and the hiss of wind across the deck. The U-boat had been forced into retreat, its attack thwarted before it could strike. Meanwhile, merchant sailors below deck clung to cargo, checking for leaks and reassessing ballast. Their survival depended on the officers above, interpreting radar blips, issuing orders, and maintaining formations. It was a collaboration of trust, training, and technology. Men who had once been mere passengers now played a role in a complex, coordinated defense. Each crew member understood that radar was not infallible, but combined with vigilance and experience, it had transformed the Atlantic from a perilous, unpredictable expanse into a domain where decisions could save lives and shipments. By early afternoon, the Wolfpack's efforts had been effectively neutralized. Multiple contacts had been detected, plotted, and either avoided or engaged. No merchant ships had been lost. Several U-boats were forced to retreat to safer waters, their crews frustrated and disoriented. The Axis had assumed the Americans were lost at sea, but their confidence had been shattered. Radar had allowed the convoy to detect threats, adjust positions, and neutralize attacks, turning the hunters into the hunted. The human toll, though invisible from afar, was palpable on the deck. Sailors shivered in the icy wind, soaked to the bone, muscles aching from constant vigilance. Yet there was a palpable sense of accomplishment. Lives were preserved. Cargo reached its intended destination intact. The combination of courage, discipline, and technology had created a decisive edge in a battle that could have gone otherwise. Officers noted every movement, recorded every blip, and learned from the encounter. Experience was being etched into memory, a foundation for future convoy operations that would increasingly rely on radar and coordinated defense. From the Axis perspective, reports sent back to command painted a confusing picture. U-boat captains had encountered detection where none should have existed. Attacks were preempted or deflected with precision. Convoys that were thought to be vulnerable had navigated the Wolfpack threat with minimal loss. Analysts began to realize that American technology and tactics were evolving faster than anticipated, and that the Atlantic was no longer a predictable hunting ground. Confidence had been replaced with uncertainty, caution, and the first inklings of respect for the enemy's newfound capability. As night fell, the convoy pressed on, the ocean turning a deep indigo under a cold, starless sky. Radar screens continued to sweep, every echo of movement cataloged and assessed. Men below deck slept in brief, exhausted intervals, while officers reviewed reports, plotted future courses, and planned contingencies. The encounter had ended, yet its significance reverberated across the Atlantic. The Axis had assumed the Americans were lost. Instead, radar had proven otherwise. In this engagement, the principles of modern naval warfare were on full display. Technology extended human perception, coordination amplified effectiveness, and leadership turned information into action. The convoy had survived, not through chance or luck, but through the integration of sight, strategy, and foresight. What had once been a theater of fear and unpredictability had become a laboratory of adaptation, where the invisible could be revealed and the assumptions of the enemy could be shattered in real time. The Atlantic remained vast and dangerous, but a turning point had been reached. Radar had illuminated the unseen. Sailors had acted decisively. Commanders had made informed choices. And the Axis, confident in their supremacy, had been confronted with the stark reality. The Americans were no longer adrift at sea. They were alert, prepared, and capable of changing the rules of engagement forever. The immediate consequences of the convoy engagement were both tangible and psychological. American Naval Command noted that convoy PQ-17 had reached its destination largely intact, with minimal losses. Cargo that included tanks, artillery, ammunition, and vital food supplies arrived at ports in the Soviet Union, sustaining the Eastern Front at a critical moment. For the sailors aboard the destroyers and merchant ships, the sense of relief was tempered by exhaustion, frostbite, and the ever-present awareness that the Atlantic was still a deadly expanse. The operation, while successful, had required constant vigilance, split-second decision-making, and the seamless coordination of human and technological resources. Naval reports highlighted the effectiveness of radar in early detection and engagement. U-boat approaches had been consistently monitored, and evasive or counterattack maneuvers had been executed with precision. These reports emphasized a new reality in naval warfare, that technology, when properly integrated, could offset numerical or tactical disadvantages. The American Navy had demonstrated that what the Axis believed to be a vulnerable, scattered force was, in fact, a cohesive, intelligent, and technologically capable presence at sea. Axis forces were forced to reassess their assumptions. German Naval Command received reports from U-boat captains frustrated by repeated failures to intercept or damage convoys. The Wolfpack tactics, once devastatingly effective, had been disrupted. The perception of control over the Atlantic, so confidently assumed, had been undermined by instruments and strategies the Germans had underestimated. Confidence gave way to uncertainty, and Axis commanders began to revise their operational orders, delaying attacks, dispersing patrols, and exercising more caution in subsequent engagements. Strategically, the implications were far-reaching. Convoy operations were now recognized as not only logistical necessities, but as platforms for tactical innovation. Radar-enabled ships could anticipate attacks, preserve vital supplies, and maintain morale among crews. The integration of intelligence, technology, and disciplined execution became a blueprint for future operations. American officers meticulously documented every radar reading, every maneuver, and every outcome, refining tactics that would be applied in the Atlantic and later the Pacific. The ability to detect threats before they could strike fundamentally altered naval doctrine. The human dimension of this success was also critical. Sailors who had once feared the invisible threat of submerged torpedoes began to trust the combination of their training and radar instrumentation. Confidence, once fragile, grew stronger with each successful convoy crossing. The psychological effect on crews cannot be overstated. Men who believed themselves powerless against the U-boat threat were now equipped with knowledge, tools, and strategies to survive and protect the cargo essential to the broader war effort. Each safe arrival reinforced the understanding that technology could extend human capability, while discipline and courage remained indispensable. In Washington and at Allied command centers in London, radar's role was celebrated quietly but decisively. Operational planning began to incorporate the full potential of detection technology. Training protocols were updated, and ship designs increasingly accommodated electronic systems. This engagement proved the necessity of integrating innovation into doctrine, not as a luxury, but as a survival imperative. The lessons learned from PQ-17 and other similar operations informed the strategic calculus of the Allies, gradually tipping the balance of the Atlantic campaign. Yet, even amid the success, the war at sea remained unforgiving. Convoys would continue to face storms, fog, ice, and the ever-present threat of Axis submarines and aircraft. Every mission demanded vigilance and adaptability. Radar had not eliminated danger. It had simply provided the means to confront it with knowledge and preparedness. What had been assumed as lost at sea was now trackable, defendable, and increasingly survivable. The Atlantic, once dominated by fear and uncertainty, had become a theater where preparation, foresight, and technology could meaningfully influence outcomes. For the Axis, the encounter was a stark revelation. German Naval Command could no longer assume American convoys were easy prey. Reports from U-boat captains documented frustration and confusion. Ships that should have been vulnerable were now evasive, their movements guided by unseen detection systems. The Wolfpack tactics, previously effective, required reassessment. Coordinated attacks became riskier. The element of surprise, so critical to submarine warfare, was now compromised. Submarine patrols were redirected, orders modified, and commanders instructed to exercise greater caution when approaching radar-equipped convoys. The strategic ripple effect extended beyond a single convoy. Axis confidence in dominating the Atlantic had been shaken. Operations that once relied on predictable patterns of interception now faced uncertainty. The Germans had underestimated both the speed at which the Americans could adopt new technology and the skill with which crews could integrate it into existing naval tactics. The psychological impact was tangible. Officers became hesitant, patrols more dispersed, and decisions delayed as commanders sought to avoid repeated failures. Intelligence alone could no longer dictate action. Practical experience revealed that the enemy was learning, adapting, and, crucially, observing in ways that could no longer be ignored. For the Americans, the outcome was transformative. Radar-equipped ships proved that technology could extend human capability, reduce losses, and increase operational confidence. Convoys now navigated with a dual sense of caution and empowerment. Captains could make informed decisions, predicting enemy movements and preempting attacks. Sailors, previously at the mercy of unseen torpedoes, learned to rely on instruments and teamwork to protect themselves and the cargo critical to the war effort. The success reinforced the value of innovation, coordination, and training, a combination that would shape the conduct of naval warfare for the remainder of the conflict. The broader strategic implications were profound. The Atlantic, once dominated by fear of the invisible U-boat threat, became a proving ground for new doctrine. Radar was no longer experimental, it was essential. Escort formations evolved, convoy planning incorporated early detection protocols, and the integration of electronic surveillance into everyday naval operations became standard. Commanders across theaters recognized that technology, when combined with disciplined execution, could shift the balance of power. Allied supply lines became more secure, sustaining critical campaigns in Europe and supporting the Eastern Front, where every shipment of tanks, ammunition, and provisions mattered. Morale, both at sea and on shore, was bolstered. Crews gained confidence that they were not adrift at the mercy of the enemy, but equipped to survive and succeed. Leadership adapted to a world where rapid information flow mattered as much as courage. Radar's effectiveness validated investment in technology and reinforced the philosophy that survival in modern naval warfare depended on foresight, adaptability, and integration of human and mechanical capabilities. The Axis, meanwhile, were forced into a defensive posture. Each U-boat attack now carried heightened risk. Submarines were detected earlier, countered more effectively, and sometimes neutralized before they could launch. The illusion that Americans were lost at sea had been shattered, and the operational landscape was irrevocably changed. The psychological edge that had long favored the U-boat fleet diminished. The Atlantic was no longer an open hunting ground. It was a contested space where unseen eyes could expose vulnerability and where human skill combined with technology could dictate outcomes. By the close of the engagement and its immediate aftermath, one lesson was clear. Radar had transformed the calculus of naval warfare. It was a tool of survival, a force multiplier, and a revelation for both sides. The Americans had proven that what the Axis assumed was lost could, in fact, be defended, guided, and controlled. Convoys now had the power of foresight, and the ocean, once the Axis' greatest ally, had become a domain where the unseen could be revealed and human ingenuity could prevail. The story of radar in the Atlantic is more than a tale of technology. It is a testament to human adaptation under pressure. What the Axis assumed lost at sea was, in reality, far from helpless. It was a force guided by vigilance, courage, and innovation. Men on deck, shivering in freezing winds, staring at glowing screens, made decisions that combined instinct with instruments, turning uncertainty into survival. The Atlantic, once a theater dominated by fear and chance, became a proving ground for foresight and preparation. Radar altered the very nature of naval warfare. It extended human senses, translating the invisible into actionable intelligence. Convoys could anticipate threats, maneuver with precision, and preserve both lives and essential cargo. Officers learned to lead not only by courage, but by the interpretation of data, guiding ships through danger with calculated certainty. Technology alone was not enough. It was the integration of human judgment with these instruments that created decisive advantage. For the Axis, the lesson was harsh. Overconfidence in invisibility proved costly. The wolf packs had relied on stealth, speed, and assumption. Radar revealed that these assumptions were fragile. The ocean could no longer conceal. It could be read, interpreted, and acted upon. What had once been a domain of terror became a domain of contest, where the invisible became visible and strategy became measurable. Yet the most enduring reflection lies in human ingenuity. Men and machines together reshaped the Atlantic. The survival of convoys depended not on luck, but on observation, coordination, and courage combined with innovation. It is a reminder that technology does not replace human skill, it magnifies it. Ultimately, this episode illuminates a truth about warfare and history. Perception shapes reality. The Axis believed the Americans were adrift, lost in the vastness of the sea. Radar proved otherwise. And in that revelation, the tide of naval warfare, the lives of sailors, and the flow of essential resources were forever changed. The unseen became known, the vulnerable became resilient, and the ocean, indifferent yet revealing, bore witness to the transformation.